April 8, 1944. 27,000 feet above northern France, the air tasted of oil and frost. The sun was a hard coin on the horizon, and the wind carved thin blue ridges across the clouds below. In the cockpit of AP-51, the canopy glass trembled with wake vibration as the pilot stared toward the bomber stream, a living column of B-17s and B-24s like a slow, lumbering swarm of iron whales below. Captain Robert Hayes watched his altimeter like a surgeon watches a pulse. Every inch of height mattered. The sky around him was a theater of sound, the distant thrum of friendly engines, the whining scream of a Luftwaffe interceptor somewhere off the tail, the soft click of instruments. For hours his group had hunted at the edge of the bomber escort, flak thudding somewhere to the east, tracer stitching the air like white thread. Today, as on too many days, victory depended on endurance. Hayes felt the Mustang's long nose fall away under the Merlin's bark when he opened the throttle. The throttle lever was a familiar weight in his gloved hand. The new engine, barely months in service in this airframe, answered with immediate, eager power. Behind him in the formation, another Mustang made a lazy corkscrew and danced toward a Messerschmitt. Its pilot voiced tight, called a kill and banked away. Around him, the air was a mixture of bravery and brittle fear. Men and machines stretched thin at the edge of range charts, the map lines that had told planners where aircraft should turn home now mere suggestions. This scene, cold, noisy, and taut as a wire, would not exist without a long string of compromises, late nights, and one seemingly impossible idea. Less than 2 years earlier, the Mustang he flew would have been a different animal altogether. The same fuselage and wing but underpowered at altitude, a short-range escort, a killer on the low front but ineffective where the Luftwaffe liked to fight, up high. The difference between those two Mustangs was not paint or pilot skill alone. It was a heart change, an engine swap so profound that engineering managers said it could not be done without tearing the airplane apart. Hayes was not thinking about blueprints. He was thinking about gas. He was thinking about the thin hush that signaled the Merlin running lean at altitude and the way the temperature needles climbed when he moved the propeller pitch. He tucked his chin closer to the rear view and squinted against the sun. In the rucksack behind his ejector seat a photograph was folded, a small smiling picture of his younger brother at home. The Mustang was more than machine to him, it was a lifeline. Below the surface drama of throttle and turn, engineers and technicians had been arguing for months in smoky hangars and cemented offices halfway across 2 oceans. The original Mustang, North American Aviation's P-51, had been designed at speed to meet a U.S. Army Air Force's request for a lightweight, tactical fighter. It flew beautifully. It had clean lines, a laminar flow wing that promised low drag, and a fuselage that cut through the sky. But its Allison engine choked on the thin air found where strategic bombers flew. The Allison made the first Mustangs superb at low altitude, great ground attack ships and able dogfighters below 10,000 feet, but above that the Mustang's performance faded and the bomber crews still begged for escorts that would not leave them stranded as they crossed the Reich. That mismatch had consequences. Bomber crews learned to fly with an ever-present sense of abandonment. Fighter groups learned to count fuel drops and slip turns that would get them home. Commanders learned the arithmetic of loss. How many missions before a crew was shattered, how many sorties before a squadron needed rest. And so the problem was not only meteorological, it was moral. The war demanded a single aircraft that could be the shepherd for a bomber stream from takeoff to touchdown, that could chase enemy fighters relentlessly at 25,000 feet and beyond, and then still have enough fuel to return across the channel. In the months that followed Hayes' pre-dawn takeoff, men at 3 factories and 2 government labs would argue over whether to try what seemed impossible, to put a high-altitude, 2-stage, supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin into an airframe optimized around a completely different engine. To put it bluntly, to fit a heart that had never been designed for the body it was being transplanted into, and expect it to run without killing the patient. The thought had landed odd and sudden in the mind of one man, the design chief at North American who could see both the curves of his wing and the thermodynamic math of a different engine. His peers called the idea audacious, his superiors called it risky. Yet here, above the white roof of Europe on that April morning, Hayes felt the result as a raw, useful thing. Acceleration that still held climb at altitude, a sensitive supercharger singing in a frequency that left Messerschmitts breathing hard trying to keep up. The Merlin turned the Mustang into a different tool, one that could strip the Luftwaffe of its freedom to choose the fighting altitude. A few miles behind, the bombers gathered their own thin halo of contrails, their waist gunners hunched over corded ammunition belts. On the fighter radios, voices were clipped and mechanical, breath came short over the static. The miracle haze had under his hood was not magic, it was a string of compromises: careful cowling inlet shaping, radiator ducting that used exhaust heat to recover thrust, changes to weight balance, propeller matching, and an acceptance that the aircraft's soul might be remade in a few frantic months. But to the men in the sky, the end result was what mattered: the man and the airframe. Inglewood, California, late summer, 1940. The assembly floor of North American aviation shimmered in the California heat, a hangar so vast it swallowed sound. Workers in overalls leaned over bare aluminum ribs, rivet guns hammering in rhythm. To the casual observer, it looked like 1,000 parts being hurried into shape for a war not yet America's. But to one man walking between the jigs and wing spars, it was something else entirely, a machine that had to fly not only faster but smarter. Edgar Schmud was a German-born engineer with a thick accent and a draftsman's patience. He had worked for Fokker before coming to the United States, and when North American asked him to design a fighter from scratch for the British in 120 days, he didn't hesitate. He was small, meticulous, and absolutely unafraid of contradiction. When others talked about horsepower and weapons, Schmud talked about laminar flow, boundary layers, and drag coefficients. His obsession was with efficiency: how air moved, how lift decayed, and how a wing could cheat physics long enough to stretch a pilot's range. The result was a wing unlike anything flying at the time. Instead of a thick, cambered profile that generated drag at high speeds, Schmud's team created a laminar flow airfoil, thinner, smoother. Its thickest point moved farther aft along the chord. The design reduced turbulence and delayed the transition from laminar to turbulent flow across the wing's surface. In theory, it meant less drag and more range. In practice, it meant a fighter that could cruise farther and faster on the same fuel load. The P-51 skin, polished to near perfection, made the idea real. Schmud liked to say that the wing wasn't just built, it was sculpted. But there were limits. The British Purchasing Commission had ordered the fighter to be powered by the Allison V1710 engine, a capable rugged motor that delivered power reliably at low and medium altitudes. For a fighter meant to chase bombers high over Europe, however, it was the wrong heart. Its single-stage supercharger couldn't keep up with the thinning air above 15,000 feet. Schmud knew it. So did the RAF test pilots who flew the first versions, designated Mustang MKI. Superb at low altitude, one pilot wrote, but above 20,000, she gasps like a fish. Still, the airframe was a masterpiece. Its ventral radiator scoop, often mistaken for a drag penalty, was in fact an aerodynamic trick, exploiting the Meredith effect, a phenomenon where hot air exiting the radiator produced a small amount of jet thrust. Schmud had engineered the Mustang to recover part of the drag it created, giving it longer legs than any Allied fighter its size. "If we can give it the right power," he told a visiting RAF liaison officer, "it will outrun anything with wings." But the right power wasn't in his hands. Bureaucracy, production lines, and diplomatic deals meant the Allison stayed. North American delivered the Mustangs to the British, who used them as low-level reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft. They were good, very good, but not what the war truly needed. The Luftwaffe still dominated the high altitudes where the daylight bombers flew. Every mission deeper into Germany was a gamble with predictable odds. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could only escort the bombers partway, leaving the formations naked over the target. The 8th Air Force paid for every mile with blood and smoke. By early 1942, Schmud's engineers had already started to whisper the same heresy: what if we put a Merlin in it? The idea was nearly blasphemous. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was a British engine, deeply integrated with the Spitfire's identity. It was heavier, longer, and its supercharger system was completely different from the Allison's. Fitting it into the Mustang would mean redesigning the cowling, the mounts, the radiator ducting, even the center of gravity. October 1942. Boscombe Down Airfield, Wiltshire, England. The wind swept across the test strip in long cold ribbons, carrying the smell of damp grass and exhaust oil. A handful of engineers in trench coats clustered near the hangar doors, collars turned up, eyes fixed on the runway. In front of them, a machine that looked almost familiar, and yet entirely new, idled with a deeper, hungrier note. The badge still read Mustang, but the sound that rolled across the tarmac was unmistakably British.
The growl of a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. Test pilot Ronald Archer climbed into the cockpit, gloved on feeling the unfamiliar control panel.
The aircraft's skin gleamed with dew. Mechanics had spent nights rewiring systems, adapting the carburetor feed, and splicing fuel lines into a fuselage that was never meant to house this kind of power. The prototype's paperwork labeled it Mustang X. Its purpose was simple: to find out whether a British Heart could save an American airframe. When Harker advanced the throttle, the airfield shook. The Merlin's twin-stage, two-speed supercharger pulled cold, compressed air into its 12 cylinders, each one firing with a sharp mechanical harmony. The Mustang accelerated down the runway, faster, cleaner, more alive than any Allison version before it. The wheels left the ground and the aircraft surged upward like a bird that had remembered it was born to fly high. What the observers saw in that climb was not just a successful experiment. It was vindication.
At altitude, the Merlin S superchargé sans where the Allison used to shock.
The rate of climb nearly doubled, reaching 3,200 feet per minute. Top speed leapt past 430 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. In mock dogfights, the Merlin Mustang ran circles around Spitfires and Thunderbolts alike. The RAF engineers knew it immediately. This was the airplane they had been waiting for. Harker's report that evening was concise but electric. The transformation is extraordinary. The Mustang with a Merlin engine is a new machine entirely. High-altitude performance is superior to any existing Allied type. Those words would travel farther than any single flight. Within weeks, Rolls-Royce formally proposed a production partnership. The British could supply the Merlin, the Americans the airframe, and Packard Motor Company, already licensed to build Merlins in Detroit, could produce them in volume for both nations. On paper, it looked logical. In practice, it was logistical chaos. Blueprints had to cross the Atlantic under secrecy. Engineers had to reconcile British imperial measurements with American manufacturing tolerances. Every bolt pattern, every coolant line had to be rethought. The Merlin's intercooler system required new ducting and a redesigned radiator. Even the propeller needed change. A four-blade Hamilton standard to handle the torque. T. Inglewood. Edgar Schmud stared at the telegram from Rolls-Royce and knew immediately that his chance had arrived. The document was more than a proposal. It was permission to do what he'd already planned in his sketches. He convened his engineering team in the design loft above the factory floor. Drafting tables filled with graphite dust, blueprints, and eraser shavings. "Gentlemen," he began, "we're going to fit a Merlin into the Mustang properly." The room went quiet. A few engineers exchanged doubtful glances. The Merlin was longer by several inches, heavier by nearly 300 pounds, and its exhaust pattern didn't align with the Mustang's cowl. To fit it cleanly, they would need to move the engine mounts forward, adjust the firewall, and rebalance the entire aircraft's center of gravity. A lesser design would have fractured under those demands. Schmud's didn't. His laminar wing gave him margin. His radiator system, once controversial, now gave him room to innovate. But there was another, subtler challenge: heat. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger generated immense thermal stress. At full throttle, temperatures climbed fast enough to warp metal. The Mustang's distinctive ventral radiator scoop would have to do more than cool. It had to generate thrust recovery, maintain laminar flow, and avoid destabilizing the aircraft's trim. That single component, a curving duct beneath the fuselage, would become one of the most efficient thermodynamic designs of the war. By early 1943, the first Packard-built Merlin engines, designated V1650-3, began arriving in crates. The first test installation went into airframe number 41 to 37,352. Mechanics worked by lamplight, fitting mounts and fairings by hand. When they finally rolled the prototype, now designated XP51B, out onto the field at Inglewood, there was no ceremony, just curiosity. A few test pilots gathered to watch as Bob Chilton, North American's veteran test pilot, climbed in and strapped down. The Merlin started with a violent cough, then steadied into a rich, rhythmic purr. Chilton taxied out, lifted off, and within minutes radioed the tower, "Gentlemen, this thing's a rocket." He climbed to 25,000 feet, leveled, and pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang surged to over 440 miles per hour, faster than any Allied single-engine fighter then in existence. Chilton's grin, they said, could be heard through the radio crackle. Stood on the tarmac, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed upward. The engine sound faded into altitude and thin air, leaving only the smell of burned avgas and a sense that history had just pivoted. One engineer beside him muttered, "Well, we've built the perfect airplane." Schmud didn't reply. He just smiled, a small private smile, the kind that comes from watching the laws of physics bend, however slightly, to human intent. The Mustang had found its voice. But war doesn't care about prototypes. It wanted production, and it wanted it yesterday. The question now wasn't whether the Merlin Mustang could fly. It was whether North American, Packard, and the Air Forces could make enough of them to change the war before it was too late. Installing a heart that wasn't built for it. January 1943. The floor of North American's Plant C in Inglewood pulsed with the hammering rhythm of rivet guns and the smell of hot oil. Rows of half-finished Mustangs gleamed beneath sodium lights, bare metal reflecting the ghosts of men working through the night. The P-51B, the Merlin Mustang, had proven itself in test flights. Now the problem was far harder, making it real at scale. Edgar Schmud moved like a ghost through the hangar, coat collar up, clipboard tucked under one arm. Every few yards, he stopped to study something. The junction of a coolant line, the curvature of a new cowling, the weight sheet of a completed fuselage. The Merlin fit into the Mustang only by defiance of expectation, a mechanical sleight of hand that balanced elegance and brute force. What had been a British engine and an American airframe were now fusing into a single identity, and every bolt of that marriage mattered. The Merlin was not plug-and-play. Its crankshaft mounts sat several inches farther forward than the Allison's. The propeller reduction gear housing bulged differently. The coolant and oil lines demanded rerouting through narrower fuselage paths. The engine's intercooler and two-stage supercharger needed ducting and venting far more complex than anything the Mustang had previously carried. In a moment of weary candor, one North American engineer compared the task to fitting a lion's heart into a greyhound. The centerpiece of the redesign was the cooling system, the famous ventral radiator scoop. In the Allison Mustang, it had been efficient but unremarkable. With the Merlin, it became an engineering weapon. Schmud's aerodynamicist, Ed Horkey, refined the duct contours until they formed a subtle hourglass shape, compressing incoming air, heating it as it passed through the radiator core, then allowing it to expand and accelerate through the exhaust exit. At high speed, that expansion created thrust, small in magnitude, but enough to offset the radiator's drag. It was, effectively, a primitive jet assist built into a piston fighter. Pilots would later joke that their radiators were doing half the flying. Yet those same pilots would also inherit the consequences of ambition. The new installation required meticulous maintenance. Merlin engines demanded tighter tolerances, and the Mustang's laminar wing, designed for smooth flow, punished any misaligned panel or dent. Crews learned fast that the Mustang's beauty came at a cost. One errant rivet, one bent inspection plate, could rob it of speed. Schmud's perfectionism had become doctrine as prototypes rolled off the line. A new sound filled the field at Inglewood, a deep predatory snarl that set it apart from every other fighter. The Packard-built V-1650-3 had a voice all its own, smoother than the British Merlin, yet tuned for high-altitude American fuel blends. Test pilots said it sounded like confidence. When the first production P-51BS arrived at Wright Field for Army evaluation, the datasheet stunned even hardened test officers. The numbers didn't just edge past existing fighters, they obliterated them. A top speed, 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling, over 40,000 feet. Air range, nearly 1,000 miles, and later extended to over 1,600 with drop tanks. A rate of climb, 3,200 feet per minute. The Army Air Force's Engineering Division had been skeptical of the British enthusiasm. Now, the tables turned. Reports from the European theater described bomber losses climbing to catastrophic levels as long-range escorts failed to reach target zones. A fighter that could match the bombers mile for mile and still fight at 30,000 feet was no longer a technical curiosity, it was survival. Schmud's greatest challenge wasn't on the drafting board anymore. It was in logistics. Packard's Detroit plant had to synchronize Merlin production with North American's assembly rate, while maintaining British supply chains for spare parts. The Americans built engines by the hundreds per week, their factories echoing with the same British heartbeat. By spring 1943, the first shipments of Merlin Mustangs, designated P-51B and C, depending on plant location, began to leave Inglewood and Dallas in wooden crates bound for England and the process. A transatlantic collaboration emerged that would have been unthinkable just a few years before. Rolls-Royce engineers visited Detroit to inspect production quality, while American draftsmen adapted imperial blueprints to U.S. manufacturing tolerances. On both sides of the ocean, secrecy was absolute. No press releases, no photographs. The enemy would not learn that the Allies had just solved the range problem that had crippled their air offensives. Even in its infancy, the new Mustang demanded respect. The aircraft's center of gravity had shifted forward, requiring revised trim tabs and reinforced tail surfaces. Pilots noted a heavier feel and pitch, but they also discovered stability in high-speed dives where other fighters flirted with structural failure. The laminar wing and powerful Merlin combined into something almost unnatural, a plane that could dive like a stone, pull out cleanly, and climb again with energy to spare. When the Army's Tactical Command at 8th Air Force Headquarters reviewed the final test results, the message from Washington was simple: build all you can be. Summer 1943, the production lines in Inglewood and Dallas were humming. The first operational squadrons of P-51Bs prepared to deploy overseas. Their crews painted them olive drab and dull gray, their serials in neat stencils along the fuselage. Many of the ground crews didn't realize that inside those planes was the most advanced fusion of British and American engineering the war had yet produced. Before the end of the year, those same Mustangs would be climbing through the contrails over Germany, where the true measure of Schmud's impossible idea would be written in gunfire and vapor trails. The heart had been successfully transplanted. Now it was time to see if it could survive combat. From trials to triumph. December 1, 1943, Leiston Airfield, Suffolk, England. The morning fog clung low over the runway, a thin gray curtain through which the silhouettes of new fighters emerged. Sleek, long-nosed machines with canopies beaded in condensation. Their tails bore the red and yellow checkers of the 357th Fighter Group. The men called them Cadillacs of the sky. Officially, they were the first operational P-51B Mustangs to reach Europe. Ground crews worked silently, muffled by the damp. Fuel trucks hissed as avgas flowed through thick hoses. Armorers slid belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the wing bays. Lieutenant Charles Chuck Yeager, then just 20 years old and still new to the theater, walked slowly around his assigned aircraft, tracing the edge of the wing with one gloved hand. "She looks fast just sitting still," he said to a crew chief, who grinned and replied, "Wait till you open her up, Lieutenant. You'll see what that new engine can do." For weeks, the Mustang had been the talk of every fighter group in Britain. The Thunderbolt pilots were proud of their toughness, the Lightning men of their twin engines. But the Mustang was different. It promised what none of the others could: range. With two 75-gallon drop tanks, the Merlin Mustang could escort bombers from English bases all the way to Berlin and back. It was a mathematical miracle in aluminum and glycol. The first mission was simple on paper: escort B-17s of the 1st Bomb Division to targets in Bremen. In practice, it would be the proof of an idea. The fog lifted just after dawn. Engines caught, and then the airfield filled with the full-throated roar of hundreds of Merlins spooling up in sequence. Propeller arcs blurred in the cold air, exhaust stacks glowing orange as the mixture burned rich. One by one, the Mustangs taxied out and took off, each climbing through the thinning mist into a sun that turned the North Sea into a band of silver. At 20,000 feet, Yeager toggled his radio. "Red leader to group, tighten up. Let's see if these beauties can really dance." The formation held beautifully. The new bubble of power behind each cockpit was palpable, the throttle response instant, the climb rate steady. The Merlin purred even at altitude, where the old Allison would have struggled for breath. For the first time, bomber crews looked out from their plexiglass turrets and saw fighters still there, flying alongside them deep over enemy territory. At 11:20 hours, the Luftwaffe came. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf 109GS rose from airfields near Hanover, followed by the dark, heavy shapes of Focke-Wulf 190s. For months, German pilots had grown accustomed to the same pattern: escorts that turned back near the Rhine, bombers left alone. But now, the silhouettes that dropped in to intercept weren't Thunderbolts or Lightnings. They were unfamiliar, longer-winged, faster. The first Mustang Dove. Yeager's gun camera later showed it: a perfect merge, a rolling half-split, the German overshooting. The Mustang's laminar flow wing cut the air with less drag, allowing Yeager to pull tighter in the vertical. The Merlin howled at full throttle, its supercharger switching automatically into high gear as altitude dropped. The German tried to climb out. Yeager fired. 6 streams of .50 caliber tracers arced forward, converging on the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. It exploded in a sharp, white burst. Yeager leveled off, breathless. "Damn," he muttered into his mask, "she can climb." That single engagement told the story that statistics would later confirm: the P-51B could outfight the Luftwaffe at its own altitudes. Its high-speed dive stability, energy retention, and phenomenal range turned every mission into a lesson for both sides. By January 1944, bomber groups were reporting sharply lower loss rates on missions escorted by Mustangs. Crews began to call them angels with drop tanks. Meanwhile, at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, General James Doolittle read the first after-action reports and understood immediately what had changed. "This," he told his operations chief, tapping the paper, "is the aircraft that will let us win the air." Production accelerated. P-51Bs and CS poured out of factories in California and Texas, soon followed by the P-51D, a refined model with a teardrop canopy, 6 guns, and improved visibility. Each new aircraft arriving in England carried the same heart, the Packard-built Merlin V-1650, and the same promise: deep escort, high altitude, no compromise. Pilots adapted their tactics around the Mustang's strengths. Unlike the heavier P-47, it could sustain long climbs without overheating. Its roll rate at 350 miles per hour was unmatched, and its ability to regain energy in a dive made it lethal in boom and zoom attacks. Luftwaffe pilots began to complain that they could not shake the long-nosed devils. The tables of dominance had turned. The Mustang wasn't invincible. It could be fragile under flak, and its cooling system, the delicate ventral radiator, could turn fatal if punctured. But the trade was worth it. Each Mustang in the air meant hundreds of bomber crews with a fighting chance. By the spring of 1944, the numbers told their own truth. Where previous raids had lost 10 to 15% of bombers, missions now saw losses drop below 3% when escorted by Mustangs. For the first time, Allied bombers struck deep into Germany, Leipzig, Augsburg, even Berlin, and returned home with full formations. And through it all, Schmud's name rarely appeared in dispatches. The engineers who had drawn those lines and angles watched from California as headlines declared, "New American fighter turns tide in air war." The press didn't care who had designed it, only that it worked. Schmud didn't mind. He was already sketching refinements to the D model, trying to squeeze out another 5 miles per hour. Another 100 miles of range. The man who had once been told it can't be done had no interest in celebration, only in perfection at Leiston. As dusk fell after the group's first mission, the Mustangs returned low over the treetops, engines rumbling. Mechanics ran to meet them. Most came back shot up, but they came back. Yeager climbed down from his plane, the smell of gunpowder and hot oil still in the air. "How's she run?" the crew chief asked. Yeager smiled, wiping grime from his cheek. "Like she was born for this." The Mustang had not just proven itself in combat. It had redefined what a fighter could be, and in doing so, had given the Allies the reach they needed to bring the war home to Germany. The revolution Schmud had imagined on a drawing board had finally taken to the sky. Change the rules of escort. March 6, 1944. The first full-scale daylight raid on Berlin. Cold front had swept across northern Europe overnight, leaving the air clear and bitterly bright. More than 700 bombers of the 8th Air Force rose from bases in England that morning, silver phantoms catching the dawn. Their course, the heart of the Reich. Their problem, survival. For nearly 2 years, missions like this had meant slaughter. German radar would track the bomber streams from the Channel, and as soon as the escorts turned back, the Luftwaffe pounced. Bf-109s and Fw-190s cutting into the formations until half the crews never made it home. But this day was different. Flying above and alongside the bombers, their long noses gleaming in the winter sun, were hundreds of P-51B Mustangs from the 4th, 357th, and 354th Fighter Groups. Each carried the same Packard Merlin heart, and each pilot knew what that meant. They weren't turning back. Colonel Don Bletchley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, had made it clear in his pre-flight briefing, "We're going all the way in. Berlin and back. No halfway houses this time." It was an audacious promise, one made possible only by the Mustang. At 25,000 feet, the bombers thundered east, contrails merging into a single shining river. The Mustangs, light on fuel and heavy with expectation, weaved above them like hawks. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them over the Rhine. Over 300 fighters, a mix of 109 GS, 190 AS, and the new high-altitude interceptors. Yet the German pilots quickly realized the old pattern was broken. The Americans didn't peel away at the border. The escorts stayed, and climbed higher. Captain Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357th later described it. "They came for the bombers and found us waiting. We were where they least expected us, 30,000 feet and still with power to spare." The first Mustang dives cut through the enemy formations like scalpel strokes. The Merlin's high-altitude supercharger sang in its upper gear, the aircraft holding full throttle without sputter or fade. The Mustang could now fight on equal terms above 25,000 feet, a domain once owned exclusively by German fighters. Dogfights spiraled across the northern sky. Tracers danced among the clouds, shells flashing against silver fuselages. Pilots described the sound as like tearing canvas under thunder. The Mustangs rolled, climbed, and dove with precision, their laminar wings slicing through the thin air where the Thunderbolts would have struggled for breath. By noon, the bomber stream had crossed Berlin. Anti-aircraft fire clawed upward, black flak puffs marking the sky. But for the first time, the Luftwaffe was unable to assemble a coherent defense. Their interceptors were too busy fighting for their lives. By the time the Mustangs returned to England, the radio chatter was jubilant. The raid had reached Berlin and back, with acceptable losses. That phrase, so clinical, masked a revolution. The Mustang had broken the Luftwaffe's strategic defense. The Germans could no longer predict where or when the bombers would be vulnerable. Every attack now risked interception by a fighter that could outclimb, outdive, and outrun them. General Jimmy Doolittle understood the magnitude immediately. Within days, he changed the standing escort doctrine that had defined Allied air warfare. From now on, he ordered, our fighters are not tied to the bombers. They are free to hunt. It was a quiet but seismic shift. The free hunt order. Before, escorts had flown close formation with the bombers, waiting to react to enemy attacks. Now, Doolittle unleashed the Mustangs ahead of the bomber streams to sweep the skies clean. The effect was devastating. The Luftwaffe's attrition rates soared. Their veteran pilots, already stretched thin, found themselves hunted in their own skies. Mustang groups roamed from the Ruhr to Dresden, striking airfields, strafing trains, destroying aircraft before they could even take off. Between March and June 1944, German fighter losses reached catastrophic levels. The Luftwaffe's backbone, its trained, experienced corps, began to collapse. Pilots like Bud Anderson, Chuck Yeager, and George Preddy became legends. They learned to trust the Mustang's long legs and smooth temperament. She didn't bite, Yeager recalled. You could push her hard, and she'd just keep going. The Merlin would sing and the world would shrink to be summer. The Allies owned the daytime skies.
The Bombestream grew larger, the target deeper.
The Luftwaffe, once a terror of the early war, was now retreating into its own ruins. And as Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion approached, the Mustang's strategic value became absolute. With the skies cleared of opposition, Allied bombers and fighters could operate over Normandy with near impunity. Mustang groups flew deep patrols, cutting off German reinforcements, destroying transport columns, and ensuring that when the invasion came, no Luftwaffe force could mount a serious response. Even the Germans admitted it. In his post-war interrogation, General Adolf Galland, former Luftwaffe general of fighters, was blunt. The Mustang was the best Allied fighter of the war. It could escort the bombers to Berlin and back. We had nothing to match it. In a war of production, logistics, and attrition, the Mustang had given the Allies what they'd lacked since 1942, freedom of the air. And with that freedom, the end of the Reich became inevitable. Yet behind the headlines, the victory was still deeply human, the result of draftsmen, machinists, and test pilots who refused to accept that impossible meant permanent. Edgar Schmud, the quiet man who had first drawn the lines of the Mustang, watched from California as newsreels showed his aircraft over Normandy and Berlin. When asked later how he felt seeing his design end the air war, he answered simply, "It worked because it was beautiful, and it was beautiful because it worked." The P-51 Mustang had not only changed the war, it had rewritten the relationship between engineering and victory, proof that elegance, efficiency, and courage could exist in the same machine. But for every sleek silhouette that streaked across Europe, there was a cost, of lives, of labor, of perfection demanded at all hours. The Mustang had conquered the skies. Now came the reckoning of what that triumph had cost. Legacy and the price of perfection. July 1944. Bodney Airfield, England. The hangar doors stood open to the humid evening. The smell of hot oil, sweat, and dust hung thick in the air as ground crews worked under floodlights, patching bullet holes with fresh aluminum. Mechanics moved quietly, each lost in routine, wiping oil streaks from gun ports, draining coolant from the radiators, checking for cracks along the spar joints. The day's mission had been a success. The 352nd Fighter Group had escorted bombers to Munich and back with minimal loss. But one pilot's bunk sat empty. Lieutenant Hal Mason hadn't returned. His wingman, pale and wordless, sat on an overturned crate still wearing his flight jacket. In his hands he turned a small piece of twisted metal, part of a canopy frame, recovered from where Mason's Mustang had gone down near the Alps. The Merlin engine that had carried them across Europe, that had given them life at 30,000 feet, had failed to bring him home this time. Victory in the air came at a cost measured not in numbers, but in hours lived at the edge of endurance, the war ground toward its climax. The Mustang became both a symbol and a paradox. It was the most efficient killing machine ever to take to the air, elegant, almost perfect, yet every pilot who flew it knew that perfection didn't make it safe. The long-range missions often stretched to 7 or 8 hours, cramped in a cockpit barely wider than their shoulders. The oxygen masks froze to their faces. Drop tanks leaked. Engines seized. Still, they climbed back in every morning, knowing that their aircraft represented something extraordinary, an idea made real by hands and minds on 2 continents. And Inglewood, Edgar Schmud, continued to refine his creation. He oversaw the evolution from the P-51B to the D model, ensuring the addition of the teardrop canopy that granted pilots a full 360-degree view, a direct response to combat reports from Europe. Schmud's correspondence, Fr. From this period reads like the diary of a perfectionist at war with compromise. Margin notes demanding tighter skin joints, smoother fillets, cleaner control runs. He treated drag as an enemy to be hunted and killed. He rarely mentioned the Merlin by name. To him, it wasn't British or American anymore. It was simply right. By late 1944, the skies over Europe had changed completely. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was a shadow of itself. Mustang units ranged freely across the continent, their drop tanks glinting like mirrors as they streaked east toward Poland, Austria, and the Czech border. Pilots began to paint their aircraft with nose art, Old Crow, Glamorous Glen, Detroit, Mississippi. Beneath those names, beneath the chipped olive paint, lay a lineage of engineering genius and human persistence. For the bombers they escorted, the Mustang's presence meant the difference between annihilation and survival. Loss rates dropped so dramatically that daylight raids could be planned with near impunity. The P-51 didn't just win dogfights. It changed the arithmetic of war. Every bomber that reached its target meant hundreds fewer on future missions. Every Luftwaffe fighter destroyed meant one less defender when the invasion came. When Allied troops stormed Normandy on June 6, 1944, the skies above them were almost entirely theirs. The Mustang's long range allowed it to patrol far beyond the beaches, striking airfields and rail yards deep in France. The Luftwaffe barely appeared. On the ground, soldiers looked up and saw silver wings with black and white invasion stripes, a promise that the air belonged to them. But for every victory, there was the quiet toll of attrition. The Mustang was fast and elegant, but it was still mortal. One burst of flak in the belly radiator could mean fire and death in seconds. Pilots learned to recognize the sweet, metallic scent of glycol coolant, the smell of doom. When that odor filled the cockpit, they had maybe 2 minutes before the engine seized. Some made it to Allied lines. Many didn't. In war diaries and after-action reports, a pattern emerges. The Mustang gave its pilots power, but demanded discipline. Over-control, overconfidence, or even a moment of distraction could mean losing everything. Yet those who mastered it swore by it. It inspired loyalty bordering on love. Captain Bud Anderson later said, "She never let me down. Not once. I trusted her with my life, and she brought me home every time." That trust, between man and machine, became the Mustang's truest legacy. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, more than 15,000 P-51s had been built. They flew in every theater, under American, British, Polish, and Commonwealth colors. They destroyed over 4,900 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other Allied fighter type. But their significance went deeper than numbers. The Mustang represented integration, of design philosophies, of engineering disciplines, of 2 nations' ingenuity united by necessity. In the post-war years, the aircraft continued to serve, in Korea, in Israel, even in Latin America, long after jets had arrived. Schmud himself would go on to design other aircraft, including the jet-powered F-86 Sabre, whose swept wings echoed lessons first learned on the Mustang's drawing board. Yet he often spoke most fondly of the machine that had carried him through the war years, not because it was flawless, but because it had proven what imagination could do when boundaries were ignored. When asked decades later how he wanted the Mustang remembered, Schmud's answer was characteristically understated. It was built for a need. It met the need. That's enough. But history remembered more than that. The P-51 was not merely a fighter. It was a statement that beauty and purpose could coexist, that engineering could be art, and that sometimes the impossible is just another word for not yet tried. The skies it once ruled are quiet now, but every time a restored Mustang starts up, the Merlins roar rolling across an airfield. It carries with it the echo of that era, men and machines pushing past their limits, chasing perfection through the cold blue air.